Alec offered me a range of dates to talk to you. When he said this date, I said, well, it has to be then so that I can wish them all a happy Star Wars Day. There you are. Right. Okay. Seriously, as Alex has been saying, what I'm doing is I've been giving a series of talks under the general title of What has psychology ever done for us? And I myself, I'm a psychologist, which is a little bit like standing up and saying I'm an alcoholic. I'm a psychologist. I'm retired from working in the health service, but I'm still very involved in psychology in lots of ways. So hopefully I have a little bit of credibility for some of the things I'm going to say tonight. And the topic tonight, as Alex has said, is about myths in psychology. I'm calling it Through the Looking Glass, or Myths of Popular Psychology. I'll explain a little bit about that. That's the series, but if anybody's interested, all these things are actually downloadable from the website. So. But tonight, what we're going to talk about, I'm going to talk about, is psychology just common sense? Because very often people think they know a lot of things about psychology and a lot of things about other people. But the question is, how accurate is that? Do common views on psychology sometimes misrepresent the truth? What are some of the most common misconceptions that people have about psychological topics? What is the truth behind some of these myths and misunderstandings? Why do they actually persist? How do you recognize a myth from reality? And so hopefully I'm going to cover a lot of that ground. I always apologize in advance because I cover the ground quite quickly in order to try and get a lot in. That means also there's a lot missed out. I actually started off with something like 100 myths. I thought, no. You don't want to be here for a week, so I thought I'll maybe manage 10, and then I got writing it all. I thought, well, maybe I'll manage 7. I've got 5 to, and I'm going to skip over them pretty quickly, but hopefully you'll bear with me as I do that. The other thing which I'm going to apologise for is that I suspect there's a few sacred cows are going to bite the dust tonight, because I think some of the myths, at least, may be quite strongly held by people, and people may be surprised or astonished or even disbelieving that they are, in fact, myths. So I'm just apologising in advance for the sacred cows that are not going to survive. I called it Through the Looking Glass for a variety of reasons. One is that the sequel to Alice in Wonderland, Through the Looking Glass, is just about to come out as a film. That sort of rang bells for me. But the other thing is that when you look in a mirror, you think you're seeing reality, but in actual fact, you're seeing everything back to front. And that's a little bit like some of the things in the myths in psychology. People think that they understand what they're seeing, but it's not quite as straightforward as it looks. And sometimes it's a bit back to front. And the other thing is that having been a lifetime fan of Lewis Carroll and the Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass books, there's a couple of quotes that I quite like from that. The first one is in Through the Looking Glass when the White Queen is talking to Alice, and she's asking Alice why she doesn't believe some impossible things. And the White Queen says, why, sometimes I've believed as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast. And some of the psychology myths are also bits about like that. But the other quote is one from Tweedledee, of all people, who says, contrariwise, if it was so, it might be. If it were so, it would be. But as it isn't, it ain't. That's logic. And that's really where busting some of the myths come in. Some of it sounds good. Some of it would be interesting if it was true. But at the end of the day, it isn't. So that's the logic. And that's what I'm going to be looking at. I did think, are there any other people who could deliver this talk? Jamie Heineman and Adam Savage, for those of you who watch Mythbusters on television, but they weren't available, so you've got me. And that allows me immediately to explore one myth, which is that, come on, you're supposed to believe this. Well, as you can see, obviously, that's one myth that's busted. Psychologists don't fit this, and certainly I can't read minds, apart from yours, and I don't like what you're thinking. I will change that if I ever hear. So, myth busted in that respect. Okay, let's go on to the serious myths. One of the most common myths, myth one, is this one. And it's the notion that most people only use 10% of their brain. And this turns out to be a very common myth held by a lot of people. They believe that we're not actually fully utilizing the brain that we have and that there's a lot more potential there which we're not actually tapping into. And people often trace that back to some sayings from William James, who was a famous psychologist in the 19th century, who wrote a lot of the early psychology stuff. And what he said was most people only use 10% of their intellectual potential. And that's quite different from the notion that we're only using 10% of our brain, because what he was saying is, you may be using all your brain, but you're not using it very effectively. There's a lot more you could actually do in terms of personal development and education and so on to use it more effectively. But nonetheless, people have cottoned on to that, they've heard that in the past, and they have this notion that somehow most people are only using 10% of their brain. And it is a very commonly held belief. Even 50% of people who've been university educated will respond saying, oh yeah, I believe that's true, we only actually use 10% of our brain. Even psychology students who should know better because they're going through the psychology course, 10% of them will still say, oh yeah, I believe that's true, we only use 10% of our brain. And the most alarming one is that even 6% of neurologists, neuroscientists seem to believe this. And you think, for heaven's sake, if they don't actually understand things, we've got a bit of a problem here. So how do we know it's not true? And what is the evidence around this? Well, the first thing is, this is your brain, and nice little bit of matter in there. We're all aware of roughly what it looks like. And the brain has lots of different parts. So this is a diagram showing some of the different parts of the brain as it's been developed over the years. You've got the old primitive brain here in the middle, and bits that have been added to it, particularly the cerebellum and cerebellum in man as a species. And so the brain is not just one thing. It's actually got lots of different bits. And when we actually look at that in a little bit more detail, we can actually divide up some of these areas of the brain and see that they're doing different kinds of things. So there are different lobes in the brain, different areas of the brain that tend to have associations with particular kinds of functions. And if you want to get really technical, I don't know how much you're going to be able to see on this, certainly from the back, but what it does is to show how different areas of the brain are associated with different kinds of activity, things like memory, things like language, things like vision, things like smell, things like what we call executive function, which is where the brain tries to put it all together in order to make sense of the world and actually decide on things like actions. It's where perhaps something like consciousness is situated, although consciousness is a difficult idea. But what we're seeing in this is, this notion that, first of all, 10% of the brain is all that's being used seems very unlikely when you start to look at the different areas of the brain and the different things that they're all doing. And the analogy which I'm going to use is this one, which is about a computer. And it's, like most analogies, not a complete analogy. But if you looked in your computer and you said, what's the most active bit? You would pick out the CPU chip and would say, oh yeah, that's where all the activity is. The rest of the computer's not doing anything. Well, of course, that's absolute nonsense. The computer relies on having memory, it relies on having long-term memory in its hard disk, it relies on having input-output cards for things like vision, sound, etc. It has a sort of memory, has a circuit board that sort of holds it all together and allows the transmission of information. And in fact, in many ways, that's what's actually happening in your brain, that different bits of the brain may be more or less active at particular times because of the activities that you're undertaking, but it actually relies very much on the whole brain being there in order for the whole business to hang together and for you to operate effectively. So this notion that you can identify just one bit of the brain and say, we're not using the rest of it, would be a bit like saying the only bit of a computer that works is the CPU chip, and that's just clearly not true. There are other things that help us to understand this too, that if we look at what happens when you actually start to damage the brain, and one of the most famous cases, and some of you will probably know about this guy, is Phineas Gage, who again was a 19th century guy. He worked on the railways, and he was tamping gunpowder down into a hole in order to create an explosive, and it went off because he was using a metal rod and it created a spark. Gunpowder went off, and the metal rod came up through his head, a little bit like is shown in the skull there. The interesting thing is that he survived because, in many respects, the damage to the brain was actually quite a small area of the brain, and it didn't hit any of the really vital areas. But the interesting thing was that even though the damage was quite small, and even though he actually survived, he had major changes of personality, major changes in his ability to do a whole range of activities from losing a very small part of the brain. And that again suggests to us that, even a small part of the brain is doing something sufficiently important that if you actually take it away, you get very negative effects. And the other thing that's very much in the news at the moment, well, actually, just thinking about that particular one, the other thing that's in the news at the moment I wasn't going to talk about, but I'll just mention, is the concern that there is currently about things like rugby and boxing, and people who get injured in these sports because of concussion to the head. And what they're finding is that several years down the road, there's sufficient damage that people are suffering very negative effects, even from things which are not actually destroying large brain areas at all, but just damaging small brain areas. But the other thing that's very much in the news is dementia and Alzheimer's particularly. And this slide here shows you the difference between a normal brain and a brain with Alzheimer's. And you can see that the brain with Alzheimer's has shrunk a bit, and there are certainly more gaps in it than there are in the normal brain, but the bulk of the brain is still there. And in fact, you can see that a little bit more clearly if you look at a cross-section of the brain. You can see what the normal brain is like here, and the Alzheimer's brain certainly has bits missing. But I don't know how many of you have actually encountered people with Alzheimer's and dementia. I certainly have, many times. And you know the effects of losing these small areas are absolutely dire. It destroys the whole sense of person, destroys their memory, destroys their ability to lead a normal life. So again, this notion that 90% of our brain isn't actually being used and doing very much doesn't seem to stand up when we look at the evidence from brain damage. The other thing that's quite interesting, and it's something that's only been happening in relatively recent times, is looking at what happens when you stimulate the brain. Now, the brain doesn't have any pain nerve cells in it, and that means you can do things in the brain while the individual that you're actually operating on is still conscious and awake. You anesthetize the scalp area, but the brain itself you can mess around with while the person is still able to be awake and reporting on what you're doing. And what they do for tests is they attach a series of electrodes to the top of the brain and then stimulate different areas of the brain to see what happens. And lots of different things happen. A person might suddenly think they're mowing the lawn or something like that, because that's what gets triggered if you actually trigger that particular area of the brain. But from the point of view of this 10% myth, they haven't found any areas where they can't stimulate something. That, no matter where you put the stimulation, something happens. So that seems to indicate that there's not a huge area of the brain sitting there doing nothing. Another area here that we can look at is interesting because it's about evolutionary theory, and it's something I referred to briefly in one of my other talks when I was looking at what I called the domesticated brain in terms of how relationships are important. And what happens if you look at the developmental line of the human species is that initially, as one might expect, as we became more sophisticated, the brain got bigger and probably was at its peak somewhere around the Neanderthal time. And then it started to shrink. And when I was giving my last talk, I was talking about this guy, the initial Homo sapiens, the original modern man, who was Cro-Magnon man, and looking at what happened to the brain between Cro-Magnon man and modern man, Homo sapiens sapiens. And the answer is that our brain has got about 15% smaller. And that came as a surprise to a lot of people. But the reason for that appears to be that evolution doesn't like waste, and it's only going to sustain what it can actually use. And what we've seen is that as man has become more social, and therefore, in the case of Cro-Magnon and Neanderthal man, it was very much hunter-gathering, and you had to have a lot of skills in order to survive at all, and you were very dependent on your own individual effort. But what happened between Cro-Magnon man and modern man is that we became more social animals. We actually lived in larger groups after the end of the Ice Age. And because we were actually mutually supporting rather than relying as much on our own independent skills, what happened is that you got a certain amount of refinement in terms of what people's brains were actually doing. They were able to rely more on social support, for example, rather than individual skills. And so what we've seen is actually the brain getting slightly smaller. And when you ask why is that, if we actually look at the importance of the brain in the body, it only accounts for something like 2 to 3% of the body mass, but it consumes something like 20% of the body energy. So brains are expensive in evolutionary terms. You've got to be doing a lot to actually provide the energy to allow a brain to work effectively, and therefore there is a high cost to having a big brain. And evolution's pretty sensible, and it says if there's a high cost and no return, get rid of some of it. And so what the evolution has actually done is to reduce our brain size to the facilities that we actually need. So if it was genuinely the case that there was 90% of our brain that we weren't using, a lot of it would probably have disappeared by now, because evolution would be saying, why should I provide all the energy for that? So, as I say, this is myth number one. And what we're saying is that this idea, even though it's very popular, that we only actually use 10% of our brain, doesn't stack up in terms of what we know about the brain and the evidence. Part of the reason it's popular is that people like to believe that we're all potentially geniuses if we could only find some way of activating the other 90%. So it makes a good story, but it's not backed up by the facts. So let's look at another myth to do with the brain. And this is another quite popular one. This is the idea that people are either left-brained or right-brained. And if you go onto the internet, you can find dozens of tests you can do that will tell you, are you a left-brained person or are you a right-brained person? And unfortunately, it doesn't really stack up. And they're quite keen in terms of the internet stuff, because they attach personality descriptions to this. And if you're left-brained, you're analytical, logical, repetitive, scientific, etc. Whereas if you're right-brained, you're more sort of arty, you're more intuitive, imaginative, creative, etc. And these are supposed to be meaningful differences that you can actually test yourself on and find out whether you're left-brained or right-brained. So, another good myth. How does it stack up? Well, like some of the myths I'm going to talk about, and like some of the myths that are quite popular, there's a grain of truth in that. I've already said that different areas of the brain do specialize to some extent. So you do find that different sides of the brain, the left and the right hemisphere, have different relative strength. So we know, for example, that the left brain tends to be the area that's most concerned with the structure of language, things like grammar, things like the meanings of words, putting them together. And we know, on the other hand, that the right brain is more involved in things like visual-spatial processes and emotions. One of the reasons I've got this one here is there's a quite interesting issue that tells us a little bit about what's happening in the brain. And that is, as I say, if people are learning a language, particularly children, for example, or if you're learning a language in adulthood, it's very often the left hemisphere that seems to be more active and more involved, because that's where you're learning grammar and structure and so on, except if you're learning a language that is tonal. And Chinese is a tonal language. It's not the only one, but it's a tonal language. So when you say something in Chinese, there are 4 different tones that you can use when you're actually saying the words. So my wife here, who's Chinese, could probably illustrate better than I could, but you can say things like ma, 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 ma. And these are all different meanings, because the tone that you attach to it changes the meaning of the word that you're actually hearing. So what you find is that when young Chinese people are learning the language, or if you start to try and learn Chinese as an adult, your right brain becomes more involved, because it's more involved with things like tone. So this notion that even language is totally situated in one area of the brain is not true. But it's interesting just to look at the way in which the brain actually interacts in that kind of situation, because of the nature of what you're actually trying to do. So, yes, there are some differences between the left and the right brain, but are they differences that you get flagged up in all these tests? Well, actually, when you look at it, most brain activity actually happens in both hemispheres. The hemispheres are joined by what's called the corpus callosum, and it's like a sort of highway of information that passes between the 2 hemispheres. And what you actually find is that pretty well all brain activity exchanges information across the corpus callosum. Therefore, both hemispheres are actually involved in what's going on. And even where something is initiated in one hemisphere, there tends to be almost immediate communication with the other hemisphere in order to make sense of it and in order to work with it effectively. In split brain experiments, when people who've actually had damage to their brain that has damaged the corpus callosum, so the 2 hemispheres actually become separated, what you find is that the hemispheres are able to pick up functions, so they're not as completely specialized as people would have you believe in the left brain, like right brain idea. And the other thing is that in any case, I mean, you find that the dominant hemisphere is not the same in everybody. So some people will actually have a right hemisphere that does some of the things that normally you might expect left hemisphere to do, and so on. So really, looking at this left brain, right brain bit, although it's extremely popular, and as I say, you can go onto the internet and test yourself all you like, and it'll tell you which you are, but whether that actually means anything is a completely different thing. And certainly, the two main areas that have been talked about in this, in terms of the influence it's supposed to have, is personality and learning style. And in fact, there's been no evidence whatsoever that either of these is actually a right brain, left brain dichotomous function at all, that the brain is totally involved in both personality and learning style. And this is just the quote from a result of a meta study in 2013, looking at all the evidence that was around that people were saying supported this idea. And they came to the conclusion it may be that personality types have nothing to do with one hemisphere being more active, stronger, or more connected. The evidence just isn't there. And in fact, a lot of the evidence actually rather counters it. Myth 3. Some of you may recognize bits of this. Given that we were talking about personality there, I thought we'd look a little bit at some personality measures. And so we have these ones. Rorschach plots, which are supposed to tell you about personality. Handwriting analysis, very popular in some places. And the Myers-Briggs type inventory, which is astonishingly popular. In fact, I was talking to a professional guy, financial advisor recently, and I was saying I was going to do this talk, and he said, what sort of things are you doing? I said, I'm going to talk about the Myers-Briggs. No, I had to do that in order to get this job. It's very widely used, it's very popular, but I'm going to tell you it's a myth. So let's have a look at it. First of all, let's start with Rorschach. Rorschach was a Swiss psychologist who liked doodling. He was known to his friends at school as Plex, which apparently means ink blots, because he used to have good fun making nice drawings out of ink blots. And he carried this on. He was interested in this part because apparently there was a European parlour game that involved some of this, and he was quite keen on this. But he then went on to study psychology, and he studied psychodynamic psychotherapy under a guy who had taught Carl Jung. And Carl Jung come up again later on. But Carl Jung had lots of interesting ideas about how people work, about their personalities, and the way in which personality projects itself. And he cottoned onto that and thought, I could do something with this. So he published the initial version of the Rorschach ink blot test in 1921. And the idea was that by asking people what they actually see in the ink blots, what's known as the projective test, as it mentions at the bottom there, the idea is that people are revealing something about themselves in terms of the meaning and interpretation that they give to what's essentially an ambiguous figure. And that fitted quite nicely with Jung's theories, the notion that you're going to send something of yourself out there when you're revealing projectively in that kind of way. It's actually surprisingly, astonishingly popular even now, despite the fact of the lack of evidence to support it. And in America, as it says there, in 1995, there was a survey that found that at least 82% of clinical psychologists in America tended to use the Rorschach ink blot test at least some of the time in terms of the work that they were doing, which seems quite astonishing. Interestingly, in the UK, it's never been widely used. And from the time I started training in clinical psychology, which was in 1975, it was regarded as rubbish, basically. It had very little to validate it at all, very little in terms of understanding. So there's an interesting difference between America and the UK. What are some of the problems? Well, after the test was first introduced, people were busy trying to make some sort of sense of it, establish whether it had any validity, whether it was measuring something real, whether it was reliable, whether you could get the same result if you measure people more than once. And what we found was that a lot of the scoring of this was extremely subjective, that there was no hard and fast criteria for deciding what people said meant anything specific. And particularly, it was really open to subjective interpretation, that it was quite often the therapist who was actually projecting onto what he thought the client had said, rather than anything about the client directly himself. So it was tending to, the therapist would have some idea about what kind of person this client was, and would then interpret the outcome of the Rorschach test as confirming their hypothesis about what they thought this person was like. So there's a complete lack of objective evidence for its personality descriptions, which seem to bear no relation to anything very much. And that was actually recognised by adherents to the test. And in 1974, it was radically revised, and a new system was produced that was supposed to overcome some of these obstacles and provide a much more rigorous format. But in actual fact, it didn't. There was no evidence that the revised system actually produced anything better than the old system had produced, and certainly nothing that made it comparable to other objective tests. And there are some interesting things that when they actually looked at clinicians and said to a clinician, we want you to make a judgment about this individual, and the clinician would make a judgment, and then said, and here is some Rorschach information about this individual, their interpretations got worse. They got less accurate if they were actually given Rorschach information. So it appeared to actually be interfering with good assessment of individuals. But certainly it's the case that some very bizarre responses to Rorschach plots can be revealing of certain kinds of thinking disorders, severe thinking disorders. So if somebody looks at a thinking plot and says, oh yes, I see it, you might think, there's something slightly odd about that. Maybe there's something odd about this person's thinking, and that's certainly true. But to such an extent that they found that 1 in 6 people who were actually submitted to the Rorschach test could have been diagnosed by the test as suffering from schizophrenia. And you think, well, no, that sounds a bit much. 1 in 6 people, probably not. So altogether, the Rorschach is not a very good way of assessing personality. In fact, it's got no real validity at all. Now we come on to graphology. Again, very popular in some employment situations. I know a number of people who've had to produce handwriting for their prospective employer, which has then been analysed to see whether they have the right traits to be good in that job or not. And the justifications that are given for that are things like, well, writing's expressive, isn't it? So it must reflect people's personality in some way. It comes straight from the brain, therefore it must be revealing something about the way the brain works. People write in different styles, so that must be reflecting their personality in some way. And people also say, well, the police in the courts use handwriting. Well, actually, they don't use it in order to discuss personality. What they do is document verification. They'll say, on analysing this handwriting, we can say these 2 documents were written by the same person or they were written by different people. But you don't find courts and the police actually trying to interpret any further than that. That's complete nonsense. But as I say, handwriting analysis, the notion of personality associated with handwriting has been used as a selection criteria quite widely. But when you actually test that and see whether people who claim to be graphologists and claim to be able to make these interpretations actually get it right, when you look at certain kinds of handwriting, you find that they don't. So given its uses in employment, as I say, for example, you say to people, okay, here's a sample of people's handwriting. What sort of job do you think they do? Pure chance. Say to them, how well do you think they're likely to do in their job? Pure chance. Do the personality traits which you attribute to them on the basis of their handwriting bear out in terms of how they actually behave or other personality measures? No, they don't. So again, this handwriting analysis appears to be a load of nonsense. And again, some major studies have verified that. They've looked at this and done standardized tests, etc. And there appears to be nothing to support this graphology argument at all. Then we come to the one that's perhaps the most controversial one. Some of you may have done the Myers-Briggs test. Again, it's very available on the net and it's quite popular and people like the idea. The first hint at what's going wrong with the Myers-Briggs is where it came from. It was invented by a housewife and her mother in America who thought it sounded like a good idea because they'd been reading up on some Carl Jung. I told you I'd mention him again. And they thought, I bet some of Carl Jung's ideas would be quite useful. So they weren't psychologists, they weren't trained in any particular way, they just thought this was a good idea. And what was motivating them at the time was that they actually wanted to find a way of getting more women into wartime employment. And they thought, for a variety of reasons, that somehow this test would show that women were more capable of doing some of these wartime jobs. So there was a whole different idea behind this. But when they actually submitted it for that purpose and it was actually looked at by the educational board said, this is a load of rubbish, and threw it out. But it was picked up by a test company who then marketed it quite aggressively. And that's what's been behind its success. It's not the fact that it has a lot of scientific merit at all. It's simply the fact that it's been marketed very aggressively and very successfully down through the years by the test company. And there are some other things that would give you a little bit of a hint that perhaps this wasn't terribly useful. As you can see here, this is the grid of characteristics in the Myers-Briggs type indicator. There are 8 categories, but they're in 4 lots. So you can be either extroverted or introverted. You can be either sensing or intuitive, either thinking or feeling, either judging or perceiving. And that immediately throws up the notion that everybody's got to be somehow at one end or the other end of the scale. And you think about the people you know, and you think that's probably not true. These are dimensions, if anything. People are going to be a little bit this and a little bit that. Certainly, the idea that you can just slot them into one end of the scale or the other end of the scale begins to sound a bit dubious in terms of everything we know about personality. So there's no empirical base for the categories. The idea of allocating people on a binary basis, you're either this or you're that, and you can't be anywhere in between, just doesn't make a lot of sense in terms of what we know about people and their behavior. That even if you do a statistical analysis of the questions they use, you find that it should actually throw up 6 factors rather than 4. So you think, there's something missing here anyway. The other really fascinating thing is if you take people who've gone through the Myers-Briggs test and you wait quite a short time, it could be a matter of weeks, and test them again, 50% of them will come out with a different answer. And you think, well, that doesn't tell us very much about the reliability of the test. It's poorly predictive. It doesn't tell us much about how people are going to behave, which is very often one of the reasons you'd be interested in personality. There's no evidence relating to things like job performance, despite the fact that that was one of the ideas behind it initially. And it's often been said to be an example of the Barnum effect, Barnum being the guy who ran the circuses. And one of his sayings was, give people what they want. And that's a lot of what's behind the Myers-Briggs. It says nice things about people generally, and people are going to say, oh yeah, that sounds like me, So it's quite popular on that basis, but in terms of its validity, it has very little at all, and it's certainly not reliable. Just from the point of view of personality, it's a difficult area to actually tackle in psychology. It turns out to be quite complex, as you might expect. People are quite complex. And this is the current theory, which does seem to have some merit to it. It's known as the big five personality traits. And these are dimensions. People are either more or less open, more or less agreeable, more or less extroverted, and so on. And so it acknowledges that people don't have to be one thing or the other, but can be along dimensions, and that these dimensions are mixed. And this kind of approach appears to have rather more going for it than things like the Myers-Briggs, which I'm afraid, sorry, but it's a myth. So it brings us to myth 4. And this is an interesting one. And my good friend here, Anne Lardine, who's a teacher, a retired teacher, has come across this in his own practice. And that is the idea that students learn best when the teaching style matches their preferred learning style. And there's a huge industry selling this. People are going around telling educational authorities, they have to be aware of this. They have to be thinking about, how they're actually teaching, so that the teaching style enables learning because it matches the student's preferred learning style. And these are some of the kinds of categories there that are associated with the different styles. So we've got things like visual, musical, auditory, etc. Again, there's some truth behind some of this. It's certainly true that students have different learning modes. Not every student is the same. And so there are differences in the way in which people will learn to some extent. But the notion that learning can be improved by matching the teaching mode to the learning mode is the key issue of this. And the first big problem that we run into is that nobody's terribly agreed on what the actual learning modes are. So you get some people who say, well, it's all about linear versus holistic learning, impulsive versus reflective learning, reasoning versus insight, visual versus verbal. So nobody's actually agreed how you identify a style in the first place. The one that's most popular currently is this one, which is the idea that it's about how you actually take in information. So you can be a visual person, an auditory person, or a kinesthetic person, body movement, etc. What always interests me is nobody's ever said you can be a smelly person. No, I'll leave that for a minute. But, there's all these different ideas about what actually constitutes a learning style, and nobody seems very clear. There's all these competing theories, and they're often quite contradictory. You can't believe all of these at the same time. So how do you decide what a learning style actually is? As I say, there's some issues behind this. Certain people who are learning are indeed different from each other. And these differences do affect performance in a number of ways. And it does make sense for people who are engaging in education to be aware of some of these differences. But what are some of the differences? Well, key things like a person's capacity to learn, what is their intelligence level, what's their ability level, what are their talents, that might affect how people actually learn. Things like interest and attention, which are really big. If somebody's not interested in what you're talking about or is looking out the window, they're less likely to learn effectively. So engaging people's interest and attention is important. Background knowledge is important. We find a lot of people are trying to learn advanced things but don't have basic skills like numeracy, like literacy, like understanding of language and vocabulary. And if they don't have that, then learning other things becomes very difficult because most other learning depends on these basic skills. And of course, there are some people who have specific learning difficulties. And these are all things which a teacher needs to be aware of and taking account of. But none of these are the kinds of learning styles. Students do express learning preferences, but under controlled conditions, when you actually see if you teach them in their preferred style or their non-preferred style, does that make any difference to what they actually learn? The answer is it doesn't. But some of these other factors, like interest and attention, turn out to be much more important than learning style. And again, there was a major review of a lot of this area, partly because it's been such a big commercial area and education authorities are paying out vast sums of money for somebody to come along and teach their staff about learning styles. And it was looked into, and the conclusion was that there was absolutely no evidence to justify incorporating learning style assessments into general educational practice. So what does work? Well, we know that some things do work in terms of teaching, and this is stuff which actually comes out of one of the Ofsted reports, looking at the kinds of things that aid teaching: active problem solving, questioning and challenging, sharing ideas, self-summarizing, critical reflection, mixed mediums of teaching, and encouraging assessment which measures development rather than simply attainment. These are the things which it turns out really affect how well somebody learns, and it's got absolutely nothing to do with learning style. One of the other things in terms of style and sense which comes out is the work that was done by Carol Dweck, who looked at what people believe about themselves. And she identified that you can see people in two different ways. People who believe that their ability is fixed. In other words, I only have X amount of ability and that's all I'm ever going to have, and that limits what I'm going to be able to do. Or people who have a growth approach, which is, well, that's what I can do now, but if I actually do a bit of work and expand myself and test myself and stretch my abilities, I can learn to do more. And that's turned out to be enormously important in terms of motivating people to actually do work and succeed. And people who have got that growth model tend to deal with setbacks much better because they say, well, okay, I didn't do that well today, but I could do better tomorrow. Whereas the fixed person says, well, that's it, I'm giving up. There's no point, I failed, so that's it. So this is the kind of diagram that suggests that the cartoon either a fixed concrete block or it's something that's going to grow. And that turns out to be quite important in terms of how well people learn. Nothing to do with the kinds of learning style that we usually find out. Myth 5. Right? So this one is about polygraphs are a reliable way of detecting dishonesty. And you may say to yourself, why has he got Wonder Woman up there? Well, I'm about to reveal something really quite interesting to you. The guy who invented the original lie detector was a psychologist called William Moulton Marston in the 1920s. And he actually used a machine which measures systolic blood pressure as a way of detecting lies. But he had another career. He was actually a guy who invented comic strip characters. And which comic strip character did he develop? Well, he actually invented Wonder Woman. So it's not just my childhood crush on Linda Carter that made me put this up. And what does Linda Carter have as one of her tools? All these people who are DC Comics fans, etc. She had a lasso of truth. So you wrap the person in the lasso, and when they were wrapped in that lasso, they could not tell a lie. So here we have the guy who invented the lie detector, also creating the comic character who was a bit of a lie detector herself. So interesting history that most people don't know. Besides which, I do quite like Linda Carter. It's nice to put on the photos there. So anyway, when lie detectors are actually used, they're usually measuring a range of things. They're usually measuring things like breathing rate, respiration rate, skin conductance level, blood pressure, measuring heart rate, etc. And the assumption behind this, because these are all autonomic nervous system measures, and what they're essentially all doing is measuring the level of arousal in the body. And the assumption that underpins this is that if people are telling a lie, then somehow they become more aroused or more anxious because they're not telling the truth. And you then detect that through these different measures. And we can then put them through a standardized test. It's a thing called the comparison question test. And what that does is to ask them some neutral questions, some questions that are almost certainly going to be true, some questions where it's almost certain they're probably going to tell a lie. Like, when you were a child, did you ever steal anything? And no, never did that. Of course, you took a pencil from your teacher's desk or something like that. So, you can actually test people's reactions through these standardized measures. And into that, you then insert the questions that are important and appropriate in terms of what you're actually trying to assess on that occasion. And you get something that looks a bit like this. So you get a record that shows how respiration rate and things are changing as you ask the different questions. And then hopefully you're able to interpret that to identify the things that actually produce the autonomic arousal, the anxiety arousal that you're going to associate with lying. But people actually respond very differently when you do this sort of thing. Not everybody responds in the same way at all. First of all, some people are very anxious even when they're telling the truth. And of course, that may be made even worse by the situation in which you're actually measuring it, because they may be suffering fluctuating anxiety because they're being tested, because they don't like the guy who's testing them. Lots of different things. So people who even tell them the truth can actually be displaying symptoms of anxiety. Equally, you get some people who are excellent liars and show no arousal whatsoever. And they pass the test with flying colours because they can tell the most outrageous lies and show no obvious reaction whatsoever. Arousal may result from other factors. It could even be down to things like what you had for breakfast this morning, depending on how that's interacting with your body. So you can't guarantee that the arousal that you're measuring is definitely down to the questions or the anxiety. You can learn to trick the process, and it's one of the things they train all the spies in. How do you foil a polygraph? And they teach them tricks like, when they're asking you a truthful question, you stick your nails into your hand to raise your arousal level. And when they're asking you a question that's a naughty question, you relax. There are ways of beating the polygraph. So in fact, it's not actually very reliable at all. And the other thing is a little bit like the Rorschach. If you tell the person who's running the polygraph, the police say, we're pretty sure we've got the right guy, then the guy doing the polygraph detects more lies. So in other words, it's confirming their expectations. It's confirming what they think is actually going to be true. And yet the polygraph is extremely popular, particularly in films and things or television series. You see, I will take a polygraph to prove that I'm being honest in this situation. There's a kind of built-in issue with the polygraph which makes it appear more credible, and that is that it's very hard to show that it didn't work. Because if the person fails the polygraph and then confesses, yes, I did the crime, well, the polygraph obviously worked. If the person fails the test but doesn't actually confess, you say, aha, we've caught a liar. If the person passes the polygraph and then makes no confession, you say, well, we're quite right then, the person's innocent, it's obvious. If your person passes the polygraph but then says, well, actually, I did do it, you say, oh, well, we've caught you making a false confession, haven't we? So there's a kind of hard to disprove the polygraph in a way. It's got this built-in bias in terms of finding out people who are supposedly guilty. Even under the best circumstances, the evidence is the maximum reliability you would expect to get out of this is perhaps detecting something like 85% of guilty people. That doesn't sound too bad until you look at the other side of the coin And that is that it would also detect 40% of innocent people as guilty. And you think, no, I'm not so keen on that. I've got close to half a chance, or one chance in two, or not quite, but getting on for that in terms of being found guilty on the polygraph when I'm actually innocent. So, no, I'm not too keen on this idea at all. And as a result, it's not generally acceptable in courts or as evidence. The truth about lies, well, there's psychology about lies and how they're detected. One of the interesting things is that people are very bad at detecting lies. So in general situations, when people are asked to do a test of detecting lies, they only tend to get it right about 53% of the time. And that's probably better than they would do in day-to-day life because they know they're in a test and they're being observant. Even if you take the stress interview situation, I mean, one of the things about a lot of these initial tests where people only detect 53% is they're asking about things that perhaps aren't that important, where the person doesn't have a really strong vested interest. So you might think, well, maybe it's a bit harder to actually detect that anyway. But even in stress interview situations, like police interview or being interviewed about something that's really important, people in general will only detect a lie about 68% of the time. And even trained people will only detect a lie about 72% of the time. So they're going to miss an awful lot. And a lot of what people believe about lying, things like this kind of tells or body behaviors that are supposed to indicate when somebody's lying, say, oh yeah, if you look up to the left when you're saying something, that means you're lying. But actually none of these tells turn out to be very significant at all in a not good way. But one interesting thing is that people who are themselves very good liars tend to be better at detecting other people telling lies. Something interesting about it. But polygraph, no, sorry, it's another myth. So will things be a hit or a myth? Why do things become myths? Well, the first thing is simply, well, everybody knows that. And you get some things that are so commonly talked about that everybody just automatically assumes that they're true. And there's no questioning of that, no testing of that. People like easy answers and quick fixes. They like an idea that sounds simple because, we could do something with that. Life isn't really complicated. People aren't really complicated. If we just look at it this way, it all falls into place and we can deal with things easily. Unfortunately, life and people don't generally tend to be like that. Things tend to be more complex. And somebody once said that for every difficult problem, there's an answer that's simple, obvious, and wrong. And unfortunately, that often seems to be the case, that the nice answers, the answers we would like to be true, aren't necessarily the ones that actually stand up. Selective perception and memory, we tend only to remember the things that seem important. One of the classic cases of that is you go and get a psychic reading and the psychic says, I've got a message here, it's from somebody called Bob or maybe Robert or John or James. Oh, James, yeah, I know James. The other names go out the window because you're actually concentrating on the thing that's meaningful for you rather than looking at the whole picture. And so a lot of mistakes are made that way. And then that gets embedded in your memory. Confirmation bias, you tend to look for things that confirm what you already believe. And that was a bit like what's happening in things like the Rorschach and the polygraph, that people have a belief about the person they're testing and their results appear to confirm the belief that they already had in the first place, which then makes the myth last longer. Thinking fast and slow, which is a phrase that was introduced by Daniel Kahneman about the different ways in which we think. Sometimes we have to react to things very quickly without considering them very deeply. If you're standing in the middle of the road and a bus is coming at you, you're not analysing the driver's tyre, thinking about the relative velocities. You're thinking, I must get the hell out of here. And you react very quickly to things, and that's what he would call thinking fast. You need an immediate reaction, as opposed to thinking slow, when you're able to actually look at things, consider the evidence, look at the balance. And a lot of the time, people are thinking fast because they have to, and therefore they like things that enable them to react in that way. Again, they like the simple answers. Causality and correlational fallacies, that sometimes people think that because two things are related, one must be causing the other. And that's generally not true at all. One of the ones which I quite liked from a study in Edinburgh was looking at people who were tested in 1932, I think it was, in 1936, and were followed up many years later because the data was available, and they looked at things like lifestyle and intelligence, and looked at the people who were still surviving in recent times. Work done by a guy called Ian Deary, appeared recently on a television program about how to stay young. But what they were looking at is, what actually tended to predict outcomes. And one of the early bits of the study showed that people who were in families that drank a lot of coffee tended to live longer and be healthier and be wealthier. And so they think coffee does you good. And then you say, no, hang on a minute. Who was drinking coffee in 1936? Well, it was rich people, people who had a good lifestyle. Another one in Edinburgh actually was saying that people who went to the theatre turned out to be healthier, more intelligent. And you think, no, hang on a minute. This is not because they're going to the theatre. They're going to the theatre because they're from that group that are more likely to be interested in these things. So people apply causality in areas where it actually doesn't apply at all. Just because two things are related. Biased samples, vested interest. A lot of study, for example, was done on whether breakfast was an important meal to start the day, and lots of people have heard, must have your breakfast. Do you think about it differently when you realise most of that research was funded by Kellogg's? Well, you may have your suspicions. I'm not going to say any more than that. Nuggets of truth, well, even in some of the myths that I've been talking about, there's some kind of nugget of truth in there, but it gets grossly exaggerated and take that proportion. And technical versus everyday terminology. Sometimes people hear a term, they think they know what it means. Classic one for me is schizophrenia. People all think schizophrenia is people who've got two personalities. Well, that's just not true at all. Schizophrenia is a thinking disorder and is not related to the idea of people having separate selves or separate personalities at all. But the popular conception is a misunderstanding of the technical terminology, and we find that quite a lot. How do you avoid mistakes? Well, if something's too simple, good or easy to be true, it probably isn't. Check the sources. There's a wonderful thing on the net called Snopes, which allows you to actually check all kinds of rumours or ideas around people, common sayings. You can look them up on Snopes, and it'll tell you very often what the background is. 50 million Frenchmen can't be wrong, which is something used to be said a lot when I was a youngster. Somebody would say, well, this is true, and you would say, well, it doesn't sound like this. Well, 50 million Frenchmen can't be wrong. The idea that if enough people are saying it, it must be true. But unfortunately, 50 million Frenchmen can be 50 million times as wrong as one Frenchman. Media like a good story. So media are very often reporting things that sound very interesting or sound very good, but good media, I have to say, generally take the effort to get it right. But some of the popular media don't. They're much more interested in something that sounds interesting to their readers than they are in being actually accurate. And so they're very often sacrificing accuracy. Conflicts of interest, who benefits from these particular myths? Kellogg's in the case of the breakfast one, perhaps. Personal bias and belief, what you believe already. Are you only looking at the evidence that suits what you already believe? Personal bias. And as I say, a scientific method doesn't answer all the questions, but should be questioning all the answers. There's a way you have to start looking at this. And a little diagram there is just saying that when you're trying to get rid of a myth, it turns out that it's not enough to disbelieve the myth. You actually have to replace it with the truth. Because if you just say to somebody that's not true, they tend to go on believing the myth anyway. You actually have to fill that gap with something else, which says, no, if that's not true, this is what is true. And then they are more likely to give up the myth. So these are some of the other myths that I was thinking of talking about. As I say, I decided only 5 would fit into the time, and that's just about right. So thanks for listening. And as Alex said, we're going to have a bit of a break. So another quote from Lewis Carroll here. Fill up the glasses as quick as you can and sprinkle the table with buttons and cats of coffee and mice and tea, and welcome Queen Alice 30 times 3. I was saying that you should, I was saying that you should always check the sources, so I thought I'd better tell you some of mine. I'll leave that up in case any of you want to follow up on some of the things I've been talking about. But thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Free. And I'm up for taking a few questions.
If there are any questions that I can answer.
Would anybody have some questions for me?
ECT damage the brain, and if so, why do they still use it?
Right. I mean, I can't answer that. It's not directly in the line with what I've been talking about tonight, but I will answer that because I actually did some research in my early days looking at ECT There are several things I need to be clear about in this. One is that there have been advances in ECT. The ECT as it was used in my early days, let's say 1975, was a much cruder thing than it is nowadays. And the experiments that I was doing was actually measuring changes in people's intellectual ability before and after ECT. And I found fairly clear evidence that you actually got long-term damage to various psychological functions. If you wait long enough, many of these begin to repair themselves. But I was testing people up to 6 months after they had ECT, and some of these deficits were still there. And it's been said that to some extent, the reason for ECT is a bit like, people have a jigsaw of anxiety or depression or whatever, which is all tightly knit together. So you take a sledgehammer and you hit it, and all bits separate up, and people have a chance to reassemble the picture in a different way. And there's some truth to that. Now, many psychologists, and to some extent me, were very doubtful about ECT, even though it is still currently used. But I have to be honest here and say that I did meet some patients for whom it was ECT or you were dead. Their depression was so severe, their ability to cope was so severely limited by the mental state that they were in, that they were deteriorating rapidly, they were unable to care for themselves, they were not feeding themselves, all kinds of things. They had been on medication had no effect, they were too far gone to respond to things like psychological therapy, and basically it came down to either we hit them with a sledgehammer or the chances are they're going to be dead. And in that sort of situation, bad as it is in some way, I could see that if that's the choice you're faced with, then maybe you give them ECT. Now, that doesn't mean that I approve ECT in general. It's now used in a much more restricted way. One of the people who was actually to the forefront of studying modern ECT was actually based in Edinburgh, a guy called Chris Freeman, that I actually worked with at the Royal Edinburgh Hospital, and there were certainly attempts to try and improve the way it worked in lots of ways. I still think for your average patient, it's a bit of a drastic solution. It's not what I would go for first. There are other things that I think are more likely to be successful. For the very worst cases, well, as I say, the choice you might be faced with is either we give them the ECT or they're not here tomorrow. And in that situation, you might say, well, okay, that's the chance we have to take. So it's not directly in line with the myths that I'm talking about tonight. But yes, I do know a little bit about that, so that's my background in it.
I get confused between the difference between psychiatry and psychology, and where you distinguish between something that may be a thinking disorder or an actual mental illness. And I don't really know where you class that. So if you took something like, for example, anorexia, is that a disorder of thinking, or is that a mental illness? Can you just help to clarify what's psychiatry and what's psychology?
Well, again, not quite in the line of what I've been talking about, but yes, I'll have a go. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people confuse psychology and psychiatry and don't understand the difference. One of the major differences is that basically psychology is not about mental health and not about mental illness. That is one section of what some psychologists do. Basically, psychology is there in the scientific study of mental and behavioral processes. And that means, we're looking at animals, we're looking at normal people. In fact, most of psychology is with people who are going through normal things. It might be education, it might be occupation, different areas where normal people are doing normal things. And there is only a small part of psychology which is particularly concerned with things like mental health. There are other bits that concern with things like physical health. So basically the way that where psychologists are coming from is saying, what does the scientific study of mental and behavioral processes tell us about how people cope or don't cope? And on that basis, are there things which we can look at that might help them to cope better? So from a psychology point of view, we don't talk about diagnosis, although we'll often use that terminology because we work in health settings, but we talk about formulation. And formulation is saying, based on how we understand how things work, this is what we think is going on here, and these are the things that might actually change it. And so we're looking at it from a completely different perspective from the medics, because they come from a disease background and they're looking at things as disease processes or body malfunction processes. And the psychologist is not saying these things don't happen, because clearly our biology and so on is intricately involved with how we actually react as human beings. But the psychologist is saying, yes, okay, some things may be biological in that way, but a lot of what goes on with people seems to be about their experience of life, their behavior, their attitudes, the way they think. And if we use that knowledge, can we actually help people to deal with some of the things that they find that are difficult? And so hardline psychologists, for example, wouldn't use terminology like schizophrenia. They would say, this person has a series of difficulties which appear to be these kinds of difficulties, which are related to the way in which they see the world, the way in which they understand the world, and there are psychological ways we could intervene in that that might help them to look at it differently. Whereas the doctor would say, they've got schizophrenia, we give them an antipsychotic drug. And I'm not going to get into the argument about is one necessarily better than the other. I mean, I think all the evidence is that each of them has strengths in some situations, and particularly, again, where you're dealing with severe conditions that appear to have a biological basis, clearly medical approaches are the right thing to do, but not always.
Most of you are aware tonight that I always wear shorts. And I always wear shorts, and it's one of the reasons, only one of the reasons, is I'm a cyclist, and anybody who goes out in the rain in long trousers is an absolute idiot as far as I'm concerned. I don't know anything about this. Is it lycra or whatever, the new stuff they wear? Anyway, that's by the by. The thing is that everybody I speak to, almost, they come up to me and say, aren't you cold? Now, this happens in July just as much as in February. Now, what I'm interested in is to what extent, as a result of all this fact only, I've come to the idea that people's brains are moulded by two things: capitalism and the media, fashion, if you want. Now, to what extent? What do you read into this? I've actually got a good reason to wear shorts, and I'm not going to tell anybody the secret here, but it suits me fine right down to the ground. But in terms of what you're speaking about, the myths, is anybody realising the truth out there?
In some ways, I mean, that does relate to what I was thinking, because I was saying one of the things that creates a myth is the notion everybody knows that. You know, everybody knows if you wear shorts, your legs get cold. But is that actually true? And I mean, it may or may not be true. But people like familiar answers, you know, and people generally go around wearing leg coverings of some sort. Sometimes women don't, of course. Women wear skirts and don't necessarily always wear something covering their legs, and they seem to get by quite nicely, and nobody asks them whether their legs are cold because they're wearing a short skirt. But, you know, the point is that people have this idea about how they think the world works, and they will look for confirmation of that myth. So, as I say, it relates to what I'm talking about to that extent. People will look for evidence that confirms what they've already believed, and what they believe will have been shaped by a whole range of things, like, you know, what the common view is. As you say, it might be shaped by things like capitalism, it might be shaped by the news media or whatever, but people come to accept that as a truth and then regard anything that diverges from that truth as rather odd in some way. So, yes, I mean, that's how people are, basically.
It's very interesting because, I mean, often in the past, you know, when people say this, aren't you cold? I offer my leg. If it's inside a building, like, offer my leg, and they test it, say, oh, it's boiling hot. But it's funny, yesterday I did this, and the lady who thought I was cold, she says, oh, it's very cold. And I'm sure she was telling her the lie. You know?
Just slightly off topic, but I couldn't resist telling this joke. It's a beautiful cartoon I saw, and it was two Arctic explorers with their parkas and things standing sort of like this, and there's a guy standing there in shorts and a t-shirt, and they're saying to him, I don't care if you are Scottish, you're not going to the North Pole like that. Anyway, sorry. Another question?
Okay, the Myers-Briggs issue, right? The core of your criticism appeared to be based on the on-off binary choice between two things. That you're either extroverted or you're introverted, or whatever the choice of the binary might have been at a given moment. I had never heard of the Myers-Briggs test or the ground under it until I was well into my 40s, and I went back to the United States, and I was looking for a change in employment. And I went to an employment, a career advice outfit. Now, there's a million of these. Nice woman gives me this test, and I just say, I've never heard of it before. Comes back with results. Now, it wasn't the sort of test that I've seen the ones you can take on the internet, the ones you can take if you buy the book and things like that. This was a rather more detailed set of results. And it placed each finding, each pair of, introvert versus extrovert, on a continuum. There was a scale between out and out extroversion over here and in a cupboard in the dark introversion over here. And you were somewhere on that scale, and you sure hope you weren't at either extreme. And indeed, the way I came out was introversion versus extroversion. That was a fairly clear decision. It wasn't like I was off the scale, but I was clearly one thing or the other. And the same was true with regard to the sensing versus intuition binary choice. The other two, I was kind of on the borderline. And I was told what's more that a great many people are kind of on the borderline. So I took this information away, and I found that it did reflect some of the things that had been troubling me in my career search and so forth. But what I found even more interesting about it was that it helped me figure other people out in a way that I hadn't been able to do before. So with great respect to your research, I would tend to think, and I'm trying not to be pig-headed about it, I'm trying to suggest that it might be a slightly more nuanced tool used in the hands of some of its practitioners than you led us to believe tonight. And I am reluctant to throw that particular baby away with the bathwater because it has been of such utility to me for the last 25 years.
It's interesting what you're saying, because what the person was administering to you was not the standard Myers-Briggs type inventory. Obviously, in a sense, they were accepting some of the arguments I made that, simply regarding people as dichotomous, one or the other is not enough, and they were attempting in some way to allow for that in whatever they were doing with you. Now, I don't know exactly what they were doing, and I don't know exactly what basis they were doing it on. But a number of people, have tried to make changes to the Myers-Briggs type of approach to make it more meaningful. The difficulty about that is that these then don't get tested because they're not the standard things that you test. So I don't know whether it worked for you or whether it didn't work for you. You're saying it worked for you, but the point is there's no way of testing that approach against other criteria.
In a very subjective way, in terms of its ability in helping me to figure out, okay, these are qualities that everybody has in some measure or other, and in certain circumstances and sets of environmental stressors, a person who perhaps reacts more with their heart or with their head is going to burst into tears as opposed to perhaps thinking about something in a less emotional fashion. There may be a way of predicting or a way of understanding when somebody does that, why they do it. So that if you're working alongside people and trying to, be a team player and all of that, it's useful to know, okay, so-and-so is much more likely to feel the pain than to see the need for a more rational suggestion and, to be entertained. And it's just helpful. And it was very helpful to me in figuring out what was going on in an office, which is something I always had a hard time doing.
The things I would say, one is that I put up the big 5 personality traits as showing the way in which personality testing is tending to go at the moment. And in some respects, what you're saying has more similarities with that than it has with the standard Myers-Briggs, because that is looking at some of the same things like extroversion, for example, but looking at it along a dimension. So, I mean, it sounds like whatever you went through was an attempt to go beyond the standard Myers-Briggs to actually address some of the difficulties that has. And as I say, I don't know them. But the other thing I would say is that what you're saying is that getting these results made you more aware of other people and to think more deeply about other people. And that's an advantage you can have whether this test works or not, in a sense, because if you actually become more sensitive to other people, more aware of other people, more aware of yourself, that may well have lots of beneficial effects, which are not a function of the test itself.
What if you give me a structure for how I understand other people? Now, whether the structure is faulty or not, I'm not in any position to judge. But it gave me a structure that I hadn't got before. And for thinking about the way I react to things, it gave me a structure for that. All I can say about the way the test was administered in my case was that I was told that the test I was getting was a more costly and thorough and more informative version of the test than you would get if you went out on the high street and bought a book or did it on the internet, which didn't really exist at the time I took it. This would have been in, I think, 1989 or 90, a long time ago. But it was fairly brief. So all I can say is that it helped, and it may not deserve quite the slam dunk that you gave.
Well, I'm glad it helped you, and I've got no arguments with that. I mean, if it helped you, that's fine by me. What I'm saying is that's not the standard Myers-Briggs test that I was attacking. So, if it's been modified in some way and it's been helpful to you in that situation, that's great. No problem with that.
I'm going to hate you for this. It fits with the myths. Is there a female or a male brain?
Want the short answer or the long answer? Do you want the short answer or the long answer? The short answer is no, there isn't. That in fact, the similarities between the brains are so great that any attempt to sort of disentangle them in terms of gender, sex, is really relatively meaningless. There are far more differences between male brains than there are between male and female brains. So, there's, I mean, that's not to say there aren't any differences between men and women. There are differences for lots of other reasons. Sorry? They're smaller in terms of absolute mass on the whole, but that's because women tend to be smaller than men. And if you're looking at something that's 2 to 3% body weight, if you've got a lower body weight, the chances are you've got a slightly smaller brain. But in terms of function, which is, I guess, what you were really asking about, in terms of the way in which the brains work, there's really no evidence that there are significant differences at all. Differences between men and women are much more to do with things like culture and so on than they are in terms of brain size or brain function. Yeah, by large, that's ethnicity. There are lots of myths that I could have looked at. One of them is the intelligence myth about racial intelligence, as it's often called, and the difference between intelligence. But if you do testing between a lot of people from different racial backgrounds, if you do a lot of testing between men and women, you will find that the average results come out slightly different for different groups. But that's not what's really important. What you're looking at is you get a curve like that with few people at this end of the curve, most people in the middle of the curve, and few people at that end of the curve. And when you actually look at how the curves relate to each other for men and women or across racial groups, the curves almost totally overlap. And therefore, the mean difference doesn't tell you anything at all, because knowing what race somebody is tells you absolutely nothing about where they're likely to fall in the intelligence dimension. And the same is true for men and women. Whether somebody's a man or a woman doesn't predict in any sense where they're actually going to be. So, 50% of women are going to be more intelligent than 40% of men or 45% of men or whatever. I mean, it just doesn't make sense to look at it in these terms. And that's true for racial intelligence. And of course, the other thing, which people often don't talk about, is that even if you do look at these results for racial intelligence, you find that sort of Western white European communities aren't the most intelligent people. So maybe people are thinking, well, maybe it's not true after all. But no, I mean, it doesn't stand up. I think probably I've had my time. But
Well, thank you very much, Ray. Please